The night was supposed to be like any other. A quiet evening, a simple drive home, and a peaceful end to the day. But what happened next would change everything. Mark and Lisa were expecting their first child, a moment of joy, excitement, and nerves all mixed into one. Lisa, 7 months pregnant, sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the soft kicks of their baby. Mark, ever the protective husband, drove carefully, making sure not to hit any bumps that might make Lisa uncomfortable. They had just left a small family gathering, laughing about something Lisa's sister had said, when flashing red and blue lights filled their rearview mirror. At first, Mark thought it was just a routine stop. Maybe a broken taillight? Maybe he had missed a turn signal. He pulled over smoothly, taking a deep breath. "Just stay calm," he told Lisa with a reassuring smile. But the moment the officer stepped out of the car, something felt off. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with the kind of authority that made your stomach tighten. His badge gleamed under the streetlight, but his eyes held something colder, something that didn't sit right. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with pleasantries. Mark nodded, keeping his hands where the officer could see them. He knew the drill. He had been taught since he was a teenager how to act in these situations. Move slow, don't talk back, don't make sudden movements. As he reached for his wallet, he couldn't help but notice the way the officer's hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching. Lisa shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Officer, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The officer's eyes flicked to her, and for a second, something dark crossed his face. He leaned down, looking into the car, his jaw tightening. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked, his voice laced with something that didn't sound like concern. Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa. "Just heading home, sir," he said carefully, handing over his documents. The officer barely glanced at them. Instead, he looked back at Lisa, his gaze lingering just a second too long. Then, without warning, he yanked the car door open. "What are you doing?" Mark exclaimed, instinctively reaching for Lisa. The next moments were a blur. The officer's hand was on Lisa's arm, yanking her out of the car as she struggled to keep her balance. The weight of her pregnancy made it hard to move quickly, and before she could even process what was happening, she stumbled. And then, a sharp kick. Right to her stomach. Lisa gasped, a choked cry escaping her lips as she crumpled to the ground. Time stopped. Mark's world tilted on its axis. 1 second, his wife was safe beside him, and the next, she was on the cold pavement, clutching her stomach, eyes wide with terror. Something inside him snapped. People always talk about fight or flight, but there's a third option. The kind that comes when you see the person you love in danger. The kind that makes your blood run hot, your vision narrow, and your body move before your mind can even catch up. Mark wasn't thinking anymore. He was acting. The officer took a step back, his expression flickering. Was that fear? Surprise? He had expected compliance. He had expected submission. What he hadn't expected was what Mark did next. And that's where everything changed. Mark barely registered the world around him anymore. Everything had gone silent in his mind, except for the sight of Lisa on the pavement, her hands clutching her belly, her face twisted in pain. The air around them felt thick, almost unreal, like a nightmare playing out in slow motion. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was happening. Right now. Right in front of him. The officer's hand twitched toward his belt, his stance shifting slightly, as if bracing for whatever was coming next. Mark could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, the surge of adrenaline making his hands tremble. But he forced himself to focus. Reacting out of pure anger wouldn't help Lisa. He needed to think. He needed to stay in control. Lisa's breaths were short and quick, her eyes darting up at him, full of panic. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaky, barely more than a breath. That single word brought him back. He crouched down beside her, his hands hovering over her, afraid to move her too quickly. "Breathe, baby." "Just breathe," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Are you okay? Is the baby okay?" Lisa winced but nodded slightly, though her grip on her stomach didn't loosen. A sharp voice cut through the tension. "Step back from her. Now." Mark looked up slowly, his expression dark, unreadable. The officer had his hand resting on his holster, his jaw set, his stance firm. A part of Mark wanted to yell, to demand answers, to make him see what he had just done. But another part of him knew that losing control wouldn't help Lisa. They needed to get out of here. They needed help. Mark pulled out his phone. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't even think about it." Mark's jaw clenched, but he ignored the warning and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "My wife is pregnant and she's hurt. She needs medical attention immediately." His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of what had just happened. The officer took a step forward. "Hang up the phone." Mark didn't move. "Sir, we've dispatched an ambulance." "Can you tell me her condition?" the operator asked. Mark stared directly at the officer as he spoke. "She was assaulted. She's in pain. And I don't know if the baby is okay." For the first time, something flickered across the officer's face. Uncertainty. Maybe he thought Mark wouldn't call for help. Maybe he thought they would just drive away, too scared to report what had happened. Lisa let out a shaky breath, squeezing Mark's hand. I need to sit up," she whispered. Carefully, Mark helped her into a seated position, his hands never leaving her. He could feel how unsteady she was, how much effort it took for her just to breathe. A car slowed as it passed, the driver's face barely visible through the window, but Mark knew they had seen. The world wasn't as quiet as it had seemed before. There were witnesses, people watching. The officer must have realized it too, because his posture shifted, the hard edge in his expression softening just enough to be noticeable. "You need to calm down," he said, but the force in his voice had weakened. Mark almost laughed at the irony. Calm down. His wife had just been attacked. His unborn child was possibly in danger, and he was supposed to be the one calming down. The distant sound of sirens broke through the tense silence. The officer exhaled sharply, glancing down the road. "You're making this into something bigger than it needs to be." Mark shook his head, a cold, humorless smile forming. "No, you did that." The flashing lights of an ambulance and another patrol car pulled up, illuminating the street in harsh red and blue. Two paramedics rushed out, their eyes scanning the scene before one of them knelt beside Lisa. "Ma'am, can you tell me where it hurts?" Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper as she explained the pain in her stomach. The paramedics exchanged glances before helping her onto a stretcher, their movements careful, precise. Mark stood to follow, but one of the officers from the second patrol car stepped in front of him. "Sir, I need you to answer some questions," the officer said, his tone measured. Mark turned to look at Lisa, torn between staying by her side and dealing with the situation at hand. But she gave him a small nod, a silent message passing between them. "I'll be right behind you," he promised her. She squeezed his hand before the paramedics wheeled her toward the ambulance. Mark turned back to the new officer. "Ask your questions." The first officer, the one who had started all of this, crossed his arms, his expression carefully neutral now. But Mark could see it, the unease just beneath the surface. Maybe he was realizing that things weren't going to just go away. "Tell me what happened," the second officer asked. Mark took a slow breath. He wasn't going to let emotions take over. He wasn't going to give them any reason to twist his words. He was going to tell the truth. He recounted everything: how they had been pulled over for no reason, how the officer had been aggressive from the start, how Lisa had been dragged from the car, and how she had been kicked while pregnant. The officer listened carefully, occasionally glancing at his partner, who stood stiffly, not saying a word. When Mark was done, the officer nodded. "We're going to need to review any available footage, including dashcam and body cam recordings." Mark's eyes flickered to the officer who had hurt Lisa. His face was unreadable now, his jaw tight. Mark knew what he was thinking. The truth was about to come out, but Mark wasn't done yet. He turned back to the officer, questioning him. "I want to press charges." The words hung in the air. The officer glanced at his partner again, his expression unreadable. But Mark wasn't backing down. Not this time. Lisa was in an ambulance, possibly in danger of losing their child because of what had happened here tonight. And Mark was going to make sure that the man responsible faced the consequences. The officer let out a slow breath before pulling out his notepad again. "Understood," he said. "Let's start the paperwork." Mark didn't smile. He didn't relax. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. And something told him the fight was only just beginning. Mark sat in the hospital waiting room, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. The white walls, the smell of antiseptic, the distant beeping of machines, it all blurred together. He had never felt so powerless in his life. Lisa was somewhere beyond those doors, surrounded by doctors and nurses, and he could do nothing but sit here and wait. His fists clenched. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her falling, heard the sharp gasp of pain, felt the fear that had gripped his chest so tightly it nearly stole his breath. His wife, his unborn child. Hurt. Because of a man with a badge who thought he could get away with it. The sound of footsteps snapped him back to the present. He looked up just as a nurse approached. "Mr. Carter." He shot to his feet. "Is she okay? The baby?" The nurse gave a small, tired smile. "Your wife is stable." The baby's heart rate was irregular for a while, but the doctors have been monitoring her closely. "She needs to rest, but she's asking for you." Mark exhaled sharply, his knees nearly buckling from the weight of everything he had been holding in. Without wasting a second, he followed the nurse down the hall. When he stepped into the hospital room, he saw Lisa lying on the bed, looking exhausted but awake. The sight of her made his heart ache. She gave him a weak smile, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Mark crossed the room in an instant, sitting at the edge of the bed and taking her hand. "Hey," he whispered, running his thumb over her knuckles. She squeezed his hand, her eyes glassy. "Hey." He let out a shaky breath, trying to find the right words. "They said you're stable. And the baby." Lisa nodded. "The baby's okay. They were worried for a bit, but we're okay." Relief hit him so hard he had to close his eyes for a second. But it was short-lived, because okay wasn't enough. What happened tonight wasn't something they could just move on from. Lisa seemed to sense his thoughts. "Mark, what's happening out there?" He hesitated, not wanting to bring stress into this moment. But he also knew she deserved the truth. The officer who did this, he's trying to cover it up. I can feel it. But I made sure they documented everything. I told them I want to press charges. Lisa swallowed, her grip tightening. And what did they say? They're investigating. The words felt hollow. How many times had people heard that line before? How many times had nothing come of it? Lisa looked at him, something flickering in her expression. "Mark, I don't think this was random." His brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" She glanced at the door as if someone might be listening, then lowered her voice. "The way he looked at me, like he recognized me. But I couldn't place him." Mark frowned. "You think you knew him?" Lisa shook her head. "Not personally. But there was something off. It wasn't just about control or authority. It felt personal." Mark sat back, his mind racing. Could she be right? If this wasn't just a case of an officer abusing his power, if there was something deeper, what did that mean? Before he could say anything else, the door opened, and a man in a suit stepped inside. He was tall, middle-aged, with sharp features and a badge clipped to his belt. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter." Mark instinctively straightened. "Who are you?" "Detective James Whitaker. I was assigned to review the incident from earlier tonight." Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa before turning back to the detective. "And?" Whitaker sighed, pulling out a small notebook. "I've seen the preliminary report, but I need to hear it from you. Start from the beginning." Mark relayed the entire story, watching Whitaker's face carefully for any reaction. The detective remained expressionless, jotting down notes, nodding occasionally. When Mark finished, Whitaker was silent for a long moment. Then he flipped his notebook shut. "There's something you need to know." Lisa tensed beside Mark. "What is it?" Whitaker glanced toward the door, then back at them. "The officer who pulled you over, Officer Grant, he has a history of complaints. Nothing that ever stuck, but enough to raise red flags. Excessive force, harassment, and more than once, the reports involved women." Mark's jaw tightened, and he's still on the force. Whitaker's expression darkened. Internal investigations cleared him every time. Lack of evidence, no body cam footage, witnesses who changed their statements. Mark could barely contain the rage building inside him. So what happens now? You investigate, and he walks away again. Whitaker met his gaze, and for the first time, Mark saw something in his eyes that surprised him. Frustration. "I don't want that. But if we're going to take this all the way, we need something solid. Something that can't be ignored." Lisa's voice was quiet but steady. "Then we find it." Mark turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Lisa." She shook her head. "I'm not backing down. Not this time." Whitaker sighed. "Look, I'm going to pull all available footage. Dashcam, street cameras, anything I can find. But I need you both to be careful. If Officer Grant is covering his tracks, he's not going to stop now." The warning sat heavy in the air. Mark's grip tightened around Lisa's hand. He had no intention of letting this go. Not after what happened. Not after seeing Lisa in pain, knowing their baby was almost taken from them. But as Whitaker left the room, one thing was clear. This was far from over. And Mark had the sickening feeling that things were about to get even worse. The drive home from the hospital was quiet, but not peaceful. Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Lisa sat beside him, staring out the window, her fingers resting lightly on her stomach. Every few minutes, she would take a slow, careful breath, as if testing her own body, making sure everything still felt normal. Mark stole a glance at her. She was holding it together, but he knew her too well. Beneath the calm exterior, she was thinking, processing, just like he was. What had happened wasn't just an accident or a random act of aggression. There was more to it. And the worst part, they had no idea what they were really up against. The city lights blurred past as Mark turned onto their street. Everything looked the same, quiet houses, the occasional porch light glowing, the sound of crickets in the distance. But something felt different. Off. He pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. Lisa hesitated before unbuckling her seatbelt. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly. Mark nodded. It was that unsettling feeling, the kind that crawled under your skin when you knew you were being watched. He scanned the street. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that didn't mean anything. He reached for Lisa's hand. "Let's get inside." They moved quickly, stepping into the house and locking the door behind them. Mark double-checked the deadbolt. Lisa stood in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, her mind clearly racing. "We need to be careful," she said. "If that officer really is trying to cover his tracks, he's not just going to let this go." Mark nodded. "I know. That's what scares me." His phone buzzed in his pocket, making them both jump. He pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. Asterisk asterisk stop digging. Walk away asterisk asterisk. A cold chill ran through him. He turned the screen toward Lisa. Her face paled. Mark's first instinct was to call Detective Whitaker, but something told him that wouldn't be enough. If someone was bold enough to threaten them, they weren't working alone. Lisa took a step closer. "Mark, what if this is bigger than just that officer?" The thought had already crossed his mind. One bad cop was one thing, but a system that allowed him to keep getting away with it, that was something else entirely. Mark clenched his jaw. "Then we make sure they don't get away with it this time." Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "But we have to be smart." Mark exhaled slowly, trying to think. Whitaker said he was looking into the footage. If we can get proof, real proof, they won't be able to cover this up. Lisa bit her lip. What if the footage is already gone? Mark didn't have an answer for that. But before he could say anything, there was a sudden knock at the door. They both froze. It was late. Too late for visitors. Mark motioned for Lisa to stay back. His pulse pounded in his ears as he approached the door. He hesitated, then peered through the peephole. Detective Whitaker. Mark let out a slow breath and unlocked the door. "You're lucky I checked before opening." Whitaker stepped inside quickly, his expression tense. "You should be careful who you open the door for at all." Lisa crossed her arms. "What's going on?" Whitaker shut the door behind him and lowered his voice. "I pulled the dashcam footage, or at least I tried to." Mark's stomach dropped. "Let me guess. It's gone." Whitaker nodded. "Conveniently corrupted. No backup. No street cam footage from the area either." He looked at them both. This wasn't an accident. Someone wiped it. Lisa's hand went to her stomach again, a protective instinct. "So what now?" Whitaker hesitated. "I still have access to Grant's personnel files." I started digging deeper, and I found something strange. A pattern. Mark frowned. "What kind of pattern?" Whitaker pulled out a folded piece of paper and placed it on the table. Over the last 3 years, complaints were filed against him. Almost all of them by women. And all of them, he looked at Lisa, looked a lot like you. Lisa's breath hitched. "What?" Whitaker nodded. Same descriptions, same type of stops. And in every case, the footage disappeared, the reports were buried, and the women either dropped the complaint or moved out of town. Mark's hands curled into fists, and no one did anything. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "I think someone is protecting him." Lisa sat down slowly, processing. "That means he knew exactly what he was doing when he stopped us." Mark could barely contain his anger. "So what do we do?" Whitaker exhaled. "I have a friend in internal affairs, someone I trust, but we need hard evidence. Testimonies. Witnesses. If we can track down the other women who filed complaints, we might be able to build a case too big to ignore. Lisa looked up. Then let's start now. Whittaker shook his head. Not tonight. You both need rest. This won't be easy. And if he knows we're on to him. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa. He hated the idea of waiting, but she needed rest. Their baby needed her to be okay. Whittaker headed for the door, pausing. I'll check in tomorrow. But be careful. If you get any more threats, call me. And don't open the door for anyone unless you know who it is. Mark nodded. We won't. When Whittaker left, Lisa let out a shaky breath. This is really happening, isn't it? Mark wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. Yeah, but we're going to stop him. Lisa rested her head against his chest. I just want to keep our baby safe. Mark kissed the top of her head, his mind still racing. He had a bad feeling this was going to get worse before it got better. And he was right. Because later that night, just as they were about to fall asleep, Lisa's phone buzzed. A single message. Asterisk asterisk, you should have stayed quiet asterisk asterisk. Mark stared at the screen, his blood running cold. Then outside, a car engine rumbled. Someone was watching. And they weren't just warning them anymore. Mark's heart pounded as he stared at Lisa's phone screen. Asterisk asterisk, you should have stayed quiet asterisk asterisk. The words felt heavier than any threat they had received before. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This was a warning. A final one. Then came the low, rumbling sound outside. A car engine idling. Mark moved quickly, grabbing his phone and creeping toward the window. Careful not to disturb the curtains too much, he peeked outside. A dark sedan sat at the curb, its headlights off, its silhouette blending into the night. He couldn't make out a face, but he knew someone was in there watching. Lisa clutched his arm. Mark, what do we do? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. Calling the police felt pointless. If Officer Grant had people covering for him, who knew how deep it went? Even Whittaker had admitted he wasn't sure who he could trust. We wait, Mark whispered. See if they leave. Minutes passed. The car didn't move. Then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the engine revved, and the car rolled forward, slow and deliberate, almost taunting. As it passed their house, Mark caught a glimpse of the driver, only for a second. A man face-shadowed, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. The car didn't speed away. It just drifted down the street, vanishing into the darkness like a ghost. Mark exhaled, tension coiled tight in his chest. They're trying to scare us. Lisa shook her head, gripping his hand. It's working. He turned to her, seeing the fear in her eyes, and it made his anger burn hotter. We have to go on the offensive. We can't just wait for them to make their next move. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. Then we need proof. Something they can't erase. Mark pulled out his phone and scrolled to Whittaker's number. He hit call. It rang and rang. No answer. His gut twisted. Lisa frowned. Try again. He did. Still nothing. Mark's mind raced. Whittaker had promised to check in the next day. He had seemed cautious but in control. Now, just hours later, he wasn't answering. Lisa bit her lip. You think something happened to him? Mark didn't want to say yes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things had just escalated in a way none of them were prepared for. Then his phone buzzed. A text. Asterisk asterisk need to meet. Urgent asterisk asterisk. It was from Whittaker. Mark read it twice before responding. Asterisk asterisk square, asterisk asterisk. A few seconds later, a reply came. Asterisk asterisk old train station, 20 minutes. Alone ****. His pulse quickened. Whittaker knew they were being watched. This was a risk. But if Whittaker had found something big enough that he couldn't even talk over the phone, Mark had to go. Lisa saw the text and immediately shook her head. "No, you're not going alone." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Lisa." "I mean it," she said firmly. "If something happens to you, what am I supposed to do?" Mark took her hands in his. "I need you safe, you and the baby. If something goes wrong, I need to know you're okay." Lisa swallowed hard, then exhaled. "Then promise me you'll be careful." "I will," he said. 15 minutes later, Mark was pulling up to the old train station on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, the tracks rusted over, graffiti covering the walls. The place was eerie in the dead of night, the only sound the distant hum of cars from the highway. He parked, scanned the area, and got out, leaving the engine running just in case. His footsteps crunched on gravel as he approached the entrance. "Whittaker," he called out softly. A figure emerged from the shadows near an old bench. Whittaker. But something was wrong. His usual confident stance was gone. He looked shaken, like he had seen something he wasn't supposed to. Mark closed the distance. What happened? Whittaker glanced around before speaking. "I shouldn't have dug so deep." His voice was tight, low. "This goes higher than I thought. Grant isn't acting alone. He's protected." Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. By who? Whittaker exhaled, rubbing his face. By people who don't like being exposed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. "I managed to recover something. Partial footage from a street camera near the traffic stop. It shows Grant approaching your car, but what's more important is what happens after." Mark took the drive, his grip tightening. "What's on it?" Whittaker hesitated. Someone else showed up. A second car. "I think." A noise cut through the night. A car engine roaring to life. Whittaker's eyes widened. "Go." Mark barely had time to react before headlights flashed, a black SUV barreling toward them. Whittaker shoved him back just as the vehicle skidded to a stop. The doors flew open. Men stepped out, fast and precise. They weren't in uniform, but Mark knew instantly. They were professionals. Whittaker reached for his gun. "Run." Mark hesitated for a split second, but then he saw the look in Whittaker's eyes. He was buying Mark time. Mark turned and sprinted back toward his car, the flash drive clutched in his hand. Behind him, voices shouted. A struggle, a gunshot. Mark didn't look back. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and gunned the engine. The SUV peeled out after him, headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. Mark gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel. He wasn't just running for himself anymore. He had something they wanted. Something worth killing for. And he wasn't about to let them take it. Mark's tires screeched against the pavement as he swerved onto the main road, his heart hammering against his ribs. The black SUV was right behind him, closing in fast. His hands were slick with sweat, but he gripped the wheel tighter, refusing to let panic take over. The flash drive was in his pocket, pressing against his leg like a burning secret. Whatever was on it was big enough that they were willing to kill for it. He had to think fast. He couldn't lead them home, not with Lisa there. He needed to shake them. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The SUV was gaining. Then an idea hit him. The old industrial district. It was full of abandoned buildings and narrow streets, places to disappear. Mark slammed his foot on the gas and made a sharp turn. The SUV followed, its tires screeching in protest. He wove through the empty streets, his mind racing. Up ahead, he spotted an alleyway barely wide enough for his car. It was risky, but it was his best shot. He gritted his teeth and aimed for it, his side mirror barely scraping the brick walls as he shot through. The SUV wasn't as lucky. Mark heard a loud crash behind him, metal crunching against concrete. He didn't wait to see the damage. He just kept going. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Lisa. Mark, what's happening? Her voice was tense. I heard a gunshot. Whitetaker's gone, Mark said, his breath ragged. They were waiting for us. Oh my God, Lisa whispered. Where are you? Trying to lose them, Mark said. I have the footage. I just need to. A loud screech interrupted him. Another set of headlights appeared in front of him. Another car. They had backup. Mark yanked the wheel to the side, barely missing the oncoming vehicle. His car skidded, tires struggling for traction as he corrected. He had nowhere to go. They were boxing him in. His mind raced. Then he saw it, a bridge up ahead. If he could get across, he might have a chance. He pushed the accelerator to the floor, speeding toward it. The SUV behind him was closing in fast. As he reached the bridge, he spotted something, a police checkpoint. Flashing lights. Officers standing by their cars. For a split second, he hesitated. What if they were in on it? What if this was a trap? But he didn't have a choice. He veered straight toward the officers, flashing his headlights wildly. The cops turned, startled. Mark rolled down his window, shouting, "Help! They're trying to kill me." The SUV behind him slammed on its brakes, skidding to a stop. The driver must have realized they couldn't chase him any further without exposing themselves. The car reversed and sped away. Mark pulled over, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The officers rushed toward him. One of them, a tall, older man, leaned down. "Sir, are you okay?" Mark took a deep breath. "I need to speak to internal affairs. Now." Lisa was pacing the living room when Mark finally walked through the door. The moment she saw him, she ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Are you okay?" she asked, pulling back to check him over. "I'm fine," Mark said, cupping her face. "It's over." Lisa searched his face. The footage. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out the flash drive. It's with internal affairs now. They saw everything. The second car, Grant meeting with someone else, the moment the footage was erased from the system. Lisa let out a breath she had been holding for hours. So they can't cover it up. "No," Mark said. "Grant is done. And whoever was protecting him. They're being investigated too." Lisa shook her head, still in disbelief. "We actually did it." Mark kissed her forehead. "We did." For the first time in days, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter. But just as they sat down, Lisa's phone buzzed. She frowned and picked it up. A text. From an unknown number. Asterisk, asterisk, you think this is over? You have no idea what you've started, asterisk, asterisk. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't over. Not even close. Lisa's hands trembled as she stared at the text. The words on the screen felt colder than the night outside. Mark took the phone from her, his jaw tightening. He had hoped this was the end, that Grant being exposed would be enough. But the message made one thing clear. There were still people out there who didn't want the truth to come out. People who thought they could scare them into silence. Lisa swallowed hard. What do we do now? Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. We don't let them win. They sat together on the couch, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on them. The last few days had been a blur of fear, anger, and uncertainty. But now there was something else: resolve. We're not alone in this, Mark finally said. Internal Affairs has the footage. The media is already picking up the story. The more people know the truth, the harder it'll be for them to hide. Lisa nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. But if they're still watching us? Mark placed his hand over hers. Then we make sure they know we're not afraid. The next morning, Mark called Whittaker's supervisor at Internal Affairs. They had already issued an internal investigation, but now that the footage was in their hands, things were moving faster. Officer Grant had been taken into custody, charged with misconduct and excessive force. But the real focus was on the corruption behind him, the people who had been covering for him. "We're going public," the supervisor told Mark over the phone. "This won't be swept under the rug." By noon, news stations were running the story. The footage Mark had risked his life for was now being seen by thousands. Headlines spread across social media, and people were demanding justice. But Mark and Lisa knew this wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that had protected him for so long. And now that system was starting to crack. Lisa sat beside Mark, watching the news, her fingers laced with his. "Do you think this will really change anything?" Mark thought about everything they had gone through. The fear, the threats, the loss of Whittaker. He wished he could say yes with certainty. But the truth was, change didn't happen overnight. "I think it's a start," he said. And that's more than they wanted. For the next few weeks, the investigation continued to unravel. Several officers resigned before they could be implicated, while others were placed on administrative leave. Grant, now facing serious charges, had turned on his former allies, trying to cut a deal. Lisa and Mark were still cautious, still checking over their shoulders, but the threatening messages had stopped. Maybe the people behind them had realized there was no stopping this now. The truth was out. One evening, Lisa stood by the window, looking out at the street. The same street where she had once feared stepping outside. But now things felt different. Mark walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking?" She turned in his embrace, resting her hands on his chest. "That I don't want to live in fear anymore." Mark kissed her forehead. "We won't." The months passed, and slowly things began to settle. The case against Grant moved forward, and new policies were being discussed within the department. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't instant justice. But it was something. Lisa and Mark knew they had done the right thing, even when it had cost them so much. And as they stood together, looking toward the future, they knew one thing for sure. They had won.